The rooftop restaurant was empty except for the two of them, the city glittering far below like something out of a dream neither of them had asked for. Damiano Conti sat at the private table, one arm resting along the back of his chair, checking his watch out of habit rather than impatience. He had told himself more than once that evening that this dinner meant nothing. A joke. A way to prove a point. Then he looked up. Julia stood at the edge of the rooftop, framed by the soft gold light spilling from the restaurant behind her. She wore a deep emerald dress that moved with her like water, her hair falling loose in a way he had never once seen at the office. For a moment, the words he usually had ready, sharp, teasing, effortless, simply weren't there. She noticed. Of course she noticed. A small, knowing smile touched her lips as she walked toward the table, her heels clicking softly against the stone. "You're staring," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "I'm allowed to be surprised," Damiano said, recovering his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "You clean up well, Ferretti?" "It's still fake, remember?" she reminded him, reaching for the menu, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing that his stare had unsettled her too. Damiano didn't answer right away. He was too busy realizing, with a discomfort he wasn't ready to name, that some part of him had already stopped believing that. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories like this to life. To understand how they got here, we have to go back 3 weeks, to a night that started as nothing more than a joke. 3 weeks earlier, Damiano Conti had no interest in dinners, dresses, or rooftops. He had interest in numbers, in loyalty, in the quiet hum of an empire that ran because he made sure it did. His assistant, Julia Ferretti, had worked for him for 3 years, and in that time she had become the only person in his life who spoke to him without flinching. She corrected his schedule when he tried to overbook himself. She rolled her eyes when he was rude to vendors. She brought him coffee exactly the way he liked it, black, no sugar, and always set it down a little too hard, just enough to let him know she wasn't intimidated. Everyone else in his world lowered their eyes when he entered a room. Julia looked him straight in the face and told him when he was wrong. He found that, more than anything else about her, endlessly entertaining. It was late on a Thursday when his godmother, Ottavia Bruni, called him for the 3rd time that week. "You cannot keep showing up alone," she told him over the phone, her voice sharp with the particular authority only a godmother could carry. "People are starting to whisper, Damiano. They think something is wrong with you." "Nothing is wrong with me," he said, leaning back in his office chair. "Then bring someone to the Greco anniversary dinner. Anyone. Prove them wrong." He had hung up the phone already halfway irritated, and it was in that irritation that his eyes landed on Julia, standing in his doorway with a folder of contracts. "Ferretti," he said before he had fully thought it through, "how would you feel about pretending to be my date for one evening?" Julia blinked. "I'm sorry? A dinner. Nothing real. My family thinks I need someone on my arm to prove I haven't become a hermit. You'd be doing me a favor." She studied him for a long moment, arms crossed, clearly deciding whether this was one of his jokes. "And what exactly would I get out of pretending to date my terrifying boss?" "The satisfaction of watching me suffer through my family's questions," he said. "And a raise if that helps." "It helps," she said, though her tone suggested she was only half convinced. "One dinner. That's it." "One dinner," he agreed, already certain, wrongly as it would turn out, that this would be the end of it. He didn't know yet that the woman standing in his doorway, arms crossed and unimpressed, would soon be the only person capable of making his carefully built world feel unsteady. He didn't know that somewhere between that first agreement and the rooftop dinner 3 weeks later, the joke would quietly stop being a joke, at least for him. But Julia, walking back to her desk that afternoon, telling herself firmly that this meant absolutely nothing, didn't know it either. Neither of them did. Not yet. The Greco anniversary dinner was held in a ballroom dressed in white and gold, the kind of room built to remind everyone inside it exactly how much money had gone into making it look effortless. Julia arrived in a simple navy dress, her hair pinned back the way she always wore it for work events, and found Damiano waiting near the entrance, adjusting his cufflinks with the mild irritation of a man who hated formal gatherings. "You look like you're about to fire someone," she said, walking up beside him. "I look like a man who has attended 40 of these dinners and enjoyed none of them," he corrected. "Try to look convincing tonight, Ferretti. My godmother has a talent for spotting lies." "I'm an excellent liar," Julia said. "Ask anyone I've ever told I was fine." He glanced at her sideways, something flickering behind his eyes that looked almost like curiosity, before he offered his arm and led her inside. The evening unfolded exactly as he expected, right up until it didn't. Ottavia Bruni approached within the first 10 minutes, her sharp eyes sweeping over Julia with open interest. So this is the woman who's kept you from becoming a complete recluse. Something like that, Damiano said. And how long have you two been seeing each other? Ottavia asked, turning her attention fully to Julia. 6 weeks, Julia said smoothly before Damiano could answer, surprising him with how easily the lie came. He's less terrifying once you get used to him. Ottavia laughed, delighted, and moved on to introduce them to someone else, leaving Damiano staring at Julia with something between amusement and genuine surprise. 6 weeks, he murmured once they were alone again. I panicked, she admitted. You froze. Someone had to say something. I don't freeze. You absolutely froze. He didn't argue further, mostly because she was right, and admitting that felt strangely easier than he expected. As the evening went on, Damiano found himself watching her more than he intended to. The way she balanced a glass of wine while listening patiently to his cousin Nico's long, rambling stories. The way she laughed, quick and unguarded, at something one of the older women said. The way she occasionally glanced toward him across the room, checking, he realized, to see if he needed rescuing from a conversation. No one had ever done that before. Checked on him. Not because they wanted something from him, but simply because it seemed to occur to her naturally. Nico approached him near the bar later, lowering his voice. She's good. Really good. Almost too good. She's my assistant, Damiano said flatly. She's paid to be good at things. Not this good, Nico said, watching Julia across the room. You should be careful. Damiano didn't respond, mostly because some quiet, uncomfortable part of him suspected his cousin might be right. Later, as the dinner wound down, Damiano walked Julia to her car, the night air cool after the warmth of the ballroom. Thank you, he said, and meant it more than he expected to. You didn't have to do that. You'll owe me, she said, though there was no real edge in it. A significant favor. Possibly several. Name your price. I'll think about it, she said, unlocking her car door, then pausing, looking back at him. You're different around them, you know. Softer. I'm not soft, he said automatically. You are tonight, she said, and before he could argue, she was in her car, offering him a small wave through the window as she drove off. Damiano stood in the parking lot longer than he meant to, turning her words over in his mind, unable to explain the strange, unfamiliar warmth sitting in his chest. He told himself it was simply relief. The dinner had gone well. His family had stopped pestering him at least for one night. That was all it was. He almost believed it, walking back to his own car alone, the ballroom lights fading behind him. Almost. The rooftop dinner, the one that would later feel like the beginning of everything, wasn't supposed to happen at all. It started with a phone call. Ottavia, thrilled by the success of the anniversary dinner, had invited the couple to a smaller gathering the following week, and Damiano, cornered once again, found himself asking Julia for one more favor before he'd fully decided to. Just dinner, he said, standing in her office doorway. A rooftop place. Private. My godmother wants to meet you properly. Julia looked up from her desk, unreadable for a moment. This was supposed to be one dinner. It was, he agreed. Apparently my family disagrees. She studied him, and something in his expression, a flicker of genuine hesitation, unusual for a man who rarely hesitated at anything, made her soften. Fine. But you're buying dessert. And you're not allowed to complain about it. I never complain. You complained about the bread basket last time. The bread was stale. The bread was fine, Damiano. It was the first time she'd used his first name without the surname attached, and something about it landed differently than he expected, settling somewhere he didn't examine too closely. That was how they ended up on the rooftop, the city spread out beneath them, Julia in the emerald dress that had, for one unguarded moment, made him forget every clever thing he usually knew how to say. Dinner started easily enough, familiar teasing settling between them like an old habit. But as the evening went on, the conversation shifted somewhere quieter, somewhere neither of them had planned for. Can I ask you something? Julia said, turning her wine glass slowly by the stem. Why did you really ask me to do this? You could have asked anyone. Hired someone even. Damiano considered lying, considered deflecting with something easy and charming. Instead he found himself telling the truth. Because you're the only person who doesn't perform around me. Everyone else calculates. You just say what you think. That's not always a compliment. It is to me, he said, quieter than he intended. She looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes, before she deflected with a small laugh. Careful. That almost sounded sincere. Don't get used to it. But something had already changed between them, subtle and unspoken, and neither of them mentioned it again for the rest of the night. Ottavia arrived briefly to say hello, charmed instantly by Julia's dry humor, and left with a knowing look aimed directly at her godson that made him distinctly uncomfortable. Later, walking Julia to her car for the second time in 2 weeks, Damiano found himself reaching for reasons to make the night last longer. "There's a case I need your opinion on," he said. "The Alberini contract. It's been sitting on my desk. It's 10 o'clock at night." "I know. You want to discuss a contract at 10 o'clock at night?" "I want," he started, then stopped, unsure for once of how to finish the sentence honestly. Julia raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I want to keep talking to you," he admitted finally, the words feeling foreign in his mouth, too honest for a man who had spent his whole life keeping things carefully guarded. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "Okay," she said softly. "Coffee. Not the contract. I'm too tired to argue about clauses." They ended up at a small, quiet cafe 2 blocks away, talking about nothing important for nearly an hour, and Damiano found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, in no hurry at all to be anywhere else. Driving home that night, he told himself once again that this was still just an arrangement. A favor between an employer and his assistant. Nothing more. But some quiet, honest part of him had already stopped listening to that excuse. It just wasn't ready to say so out loud yet. Lorenzo Greco introduced himself at a business mixer 3 weeks later, and Damiano disliked him within the first 10 seconds, though it would take him longer than he'd like to admit exactly why. Lorenzo was polished in the way men who wanted something always were, his smile a fraction too practiced, his attention landing on Julia the moment she stepped into the room in a simple charcoal dress, her hair falling over one shoulder. "You must be Julia," Lorenzo said, extending a hand. "Damiano doesn't usually bring anyone to these things. You must be special." "I try," Julia said lightly, shaking his hand, unaware of the way Damiano's jaw had tightened slightly beside her. Lorenzo lingered near her for most of the evening, asking easy questions, laughing at things that weren't especially funny, and Damiano found himself watching the exchange with an irritation he couldn't fully explain, given that none of it was real to begin with. "He's harmless," Julia said later, catching Damiano's expression as Lorenzo finally walked away to speak with someone else. "I didn't say anything. You didn't have to. You've been glaring at him for 20 minutes. "I don't glare." "You absolutely glare," she said, amused. "Are you jealous, Damiano? Of Greco?" he scoffed, reaching for his drink. "Don't be ridiculous." "Who was that man exactly?" he asked instead, deflecting with a question of his own. "And why does he know your first name already?" he asked. I told him. "That's generally how names work. Do you always smile like that when you're talking to men you've just met?" Julia turned to look at him fully, something knowing and quietly delighted crossing her face. "You are jealous." "I am protective," he corrected. "There's a difference. You work for me. I have a responsibility to know who's circling you." "Circling?" she repeated, biting back a smile. "That's a very dramatic word for someone making polite conversation at a work event." He didn't answer, mostly because he didn't trust what might come out if he tried, and Julia, watching him struggle with something he clearly didn't want to name, decided to let it go, though she carried the moment with her long after the party ended. Over the following days, Lorenzo made a habit of finding reasons to speak with her, small pretexts about mutual business interests, invitations to coffee she politely declined. Damiano noticed every single instance, tracking them with an attentiveness he told himself was purely professional caution. It was during one of these moments, watching Lorenzo linger near her desk from across the office, that Nico found him again, arms crossed, watching the same scene with obvious amusement. "You're doing it again?" Nico said. "Doing what?" "That thing where you pretend you don't care while very visibly caring." "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Cousin," Nico said, shaking his head. "You've never once walked past her desk twice in 1 hour before. You've done it 4 times since lunch." Damiano said nothing, mostly because there was nothing convincing left to say. That evening he found an excuse, there was always an excuse now, to ask Julia to stay late reviewing quarterly reports neither of them particularly needed to review. They worked in comfortable quiet for nearly 2 hours, the office empty around them, before Julia finally set down her pen and looked at him directly. "You know you don't have to invent reasons to spend time with me," she said gently. "You could just ask." Damiano froze slightly, caught between the instinct to deny it and the growing, uncomfortable awareness that she was right. Old habit, he admitted finally. I don't ask for things. I arrange them. Well, Julia said, closing her folder, standing to leave. Try asking sometime. You might find it works just as well. She left him sitting alone in his office, the quarterly reports forgotten on his desk, turning her words over in his mind long after the building had gone quiet around him. He wasn't ready to ask yet, but for the first time he wanted to be. It rained heavily the night Damiano finally told her something true. They had gone to dinner again, another fake date. Neither of them bothered pretending was fake anymore, though neither had said so out loud. The restaurant was small, tucked away from the busier parts of the city, chosen because it was quiet and because, though he wouldn't admit it, he liked having her to himself somewhere no one from his world would recognize them. The storm caught them walking back to the car, sudden and heavy, and they ended up sheltering beneath the awning of a closed bookstore, laughing despite themselves as the rain poured down in sheets in front of them. This is ridiculous, Julia said, wringing water from the end of her hair, breathless from laughing. You could have brought an umbrella. You could have checked the weather. I don't check the weather. I have people for that. Of course you do, she said, shaking her head, though her smile lingered. They stood close together beneath the narrow awning, shoulders nearly touching, the rain creating a kind of private world around them, separate from everything else. The teasing quieted into something softer, something neither of them rushed to fill with words. Can I ask you something? Julia said eventually, her voice lower now, more careful. And you don't have to answer if you don't want to. Go ahead. Why don't you ever talk about your past? Before all this? Before the empire? Damiano was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain rather than her, and Julia almost took the question back, worried she'd pushed somewhere he didn't want to go. I lost people, he said finally, simply. Early on. People I trusted who weren't what I thought they were. After that, it seems safer not to need anyone too much. Needing people gives them power over you. That sounds lonely. It's efficient. Those aren't the same thing, she said gently. He looked at her then, something unguarded in his expression that she rarely saw, something that made her chest ache in a way she didn't fully understand yet. What about you? He asked, turning the question back toward her, uncomfortable holding the spotlight alone. Why does a woman as sharp as you settle for being someone's assistant? Julia hesitated, wrapping her arms around herself against the cool air. Because being needed felt safer than being wanted. If someone needs you, they can't easily throw you away. If they want you, that's more fragile. People change their minds about wanting things. The honesty in her voice matched his own, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, simply standing there in the narrow, rain-soaked shelter, closer than they had ever allowed themselves to be. I don't think I'd change my mind, Damiano said quietly, so quietly she almost missed it beneath the sound of the rain. Julia looked up at him, something vulnerable and hopeful crossing her face before she caught herself, pulling back slightly, unwilling to read too much into a sentence said in the middle of a storm. You say that now, she said, softer than her usual teasing tone. I mean it now, he said. Neither of them moved closer. Neither of them looked away either. The rain eventually slowed, and they walked the rest of the way to the car in a silence that felt full rather than empty, both of them carrying the weight of everything they hadn't quite said yet. Damiano drove her home, the radio low, neither of them in any particular hurry to end the drive. At her door, he lingered a moment longer than necessary, and for one breathless second, it seemed as though something might finally happen between them. Then Julia stepped back, offering a small, uncertain smile. Good night, Damiano. Good night, he said. He didn't kiss her. But driving away he understood, with a clarity that unsettled him deeply, that it was no longer a question of if he wanted to. It was only a question of when he'd stop being afraid to. The trouble started with a folder Julia never should have seen and a conversation she never realized mattered. Lorenzo Greco had asked her, weeks earlier, an offhand question about a shipping schedule while they stood near the coffee machine at a shared industry event, the kind of small talk she hadn't thought twice about. She answered honestly, unaware the schedule belonged to a deal Damiano had kept carefully quiet, one that, if timed wrong, could cost him an advantage he'd spent months building. She didn't know any of that. She simply answered a question the way she answered dozens of harmless questions every week. Lorenzo used it anyway. Damiano found out on a Tuesday morning, a rival bid arriving on his desk timed with uncomfortable precision, and it took his security team less than a day to trace the leak back to that single, careless conversation near a coffee machine. He confronted her in his office, the door closed, his voice colder than she had heard it in weeks. Did you tell Lorenzo Greco about the shipping schedule? Julia blinked, caught off guard by the shift in him. He asked a general question. I didn't think. You didn't think, Damiano repeated, something sharp and wounded beneath the controlled anger in his voice. That information cost me an advantage I spent 4 months building. I didn't know it mattered, she said, her own voice rising now, hurt creeping into it. You never told me it was sensitive. You never tell me anything about the business side unless you absolutely have to. Because I trusted you, he said. I thought that meant something. It does mean something, she said, stepping toward him. Damiano, I would never. I need to think, he said, cutting her off, turning back toward his desk, effectively ending the conversation. Julia stood there a moment longer, waiting for something softer, some acknowledgement that he understood this wasn't betrayal, only an honest mistake. It didn't come. She left his office with her chest tight and her eyes stinging, refusing to let herself cry in front of him. Over the following days, Damiano retreated into the version of himself he'd been before all of this started, controlled, distant, unreachable. He stopped finding excuses to keep her late. He stopped the small, easy teasing that had become second nature between them. He answered her questions with clipped, professional efficiency and nothing more. Julia told herself she understood. His business, his empire, the things he'd built with careful, guarded effort. Of course a leak, even an innocent one, would put him on edge. But understanding it didn't make the distance hurt any less. Her sister Renata noticed the change immediately. You look terrible, Renata said bluntly over dinner one evening. What happened? Nothing, Julia said, pushing food around her plate. Work stress. This isn't work stress. This is heartbreak stress. I recognize the difference. Julia didn't argue, mostly because she didn't have the energy to. I told you, Renata said gently, though without malice. Men like that don't change. He called it fake from the beginning. Maybe it stayed fake for him the whole time, and you're the only one who forgot. The words settled uncomfortably close to Julia's own quiet fears she'd been pushing down for weeks now, ever since that night in the rain when she'd let herself hope for something she hadn't dared name. The following Monday she walked into Damiano's office one final time, a folded letter of resignation in her hand. I think it's best if I find another position, she said, keeping her voice steady with considerable effort. Somewhere the trust doesn't run out this easily. Damiano stared at her, something flickering across his face that looked almost like panic, quickly buried beneath the careful control he wore like armor. Julia. Please don't, she said quietly, setting the letter on his desk. I need you to let me go. She left before he could find the words to stop her, and Damiano sat alone in his office long after the door closed, staring at the letter, finally understanding, far too late, exactly how much he stood to lose. Damiano learned the truth 2 days later, and it arrived exactly the way most truths in his world did, quietly and far too late to feel like a victory. His security team traced the leak fully this time, past the innocent coffee machine conversation, all the way to Lorenzo Greco himself, who had pieced together the shipping schedule from several small, harmless comments gathered deliberately over weeks, weaponizing information Julia never realized she was giving away. She hadn't betrayed him. She had simply been honest with a man who'd been quietly, calculatedly dishonest with her. Damiano sat with that knowledge for a long time, replaying the conversation in his office, the coldness in his own voice, the way he'd let his fear of losing control disguise itself as anger toward the one person who had never once tried to control him at all. He found Ottavia later that evening, needing, for once, someone else's clarity. You pushed her away because you were scared, his godmother said simply, without judgment, watching him carefully. That's not new information, Damiano. What are you going to do about it? I don't know how to fix this. You start by telling her the truth, Ottavia said. The real one. Not the version where you protect yourself first. He found Julia the following morning at her sister's apartment, having gathered the courage, finally, to arrive somewhere he hadn't been invited. Renata opened the door, arms crossed, clearly prepared to turn him away, but something in his expression, raw, uncertain, entirely unlike the composed man she'd expected, made her step aside instead. Julia stood in the small living room, surprise and caution crossing her face in equal measure as he stepped inside. I know it was Lorenzo, Damiano said before she could speak. I know you never betrayed me. I was wrong and I was cruel about it and I'm sorry. That's not why I resigned, Julia said quietly. Not entirely. I know that too, he admitted, taking a slow breath, forcing himself past every instinct that told him to retreat into safer, easier words. I asked you out that first night because I wanted to see you flustered. I thought I was playing a game, teasing the one person who never let me get away with anything. I told myself, every single time after that it was still just an arrangement, still just fake. Julia stayed silent, listening, her arms wrapped protectively around herself. But somewhere between that first dinner and every ridiculous excuse I invented to keep seeing you, Damiano continued, his voice steadier now, I stopped pretending. I just didn't know how to say it because I've spent my whole life making sure I never needed anyone enough for it to matter if I lost them. And then I lost you anyway because I was too afraid to say any of this sooner. I was afraid too, Julia admitted, her eyes glistening now. Afraid you'd wake up one day and decide the joke was over. That I was convenient until I wasn't. You were never convenient, he said. You were the only real thing in a life built entirely out of arrangements. The room stayed quiet for a long moment, the weight of everything finally spoken settling gently between them. Say it plainly, Julia said softly. No teasing. No deflecting. I need to hear you actually say it. Damiano stepped closer, taking her hands in his voice quiet but certain. I love you, Julia Ferretti. Not the fake version. Not the arrangement. All of it, completely and far longer than I was willing to admit. Julia let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for weeks, a slow smile breaking through despite the tears in her eyes. That wasn't so hard, was it? It was terrifying, he admitted, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, he laughed, warm and unguarded, before finally closing the distance between them. The kiss, when it came, felt nothing like a game. Months later, at another one of Ottavia's dinners, Julia arrived on Damiano's arm without a single word of pretending needed between them, and when his godmother asked, smiling knowingly, how the two of them first got together, Damiano simply looked at Julia and said, It started as a joke. I'm just grateful she was patient enough to wait for me to catch up. Julia only smiled, resting her head briefly against his shoulder, exactly where she'd quietly hoped to belong all along. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment letting us know what you thought. We'd love to hear which part of Damiano and Julia's journey meant the most to you. Come back soon for more heartfelt stories of love, second chances, and hearts that find their way home. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.